Hello again. I'd like to begin actually the third section of Chapter 14 with a quote by Daniel Webster in his speech to the U.S. Senate in favor of the Compromise of 1850. It's found in your chapter resources here in Chapter 14. He begins by saying, "Mr. President, I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American." And the reason why I wanted to begin with this, when we're beginning to talk about the development of political parties and the weakening and disintegration of others, is that the very national identity of being an American was something that we begin to see redefined here during this antebellum period in front of the Civil War. And so your text begins with the basic idea here of the evolution of political parties and specifically political alliances and regional alliances in this period across different constituencies. So, from the period of 1850 to 1854, party lines and party loyalty blur enormously, as your book begins to tell. And I wanted to take a few seconds here to take a look at the development of the political parties specifically that your book gives you in this chart. And now notice we have the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Hamiltonian Federalists over here in the very beginning, along with some of their major supporters from the 1790s to the 1820s. It should be noted that during the period of the War of 1812, we begin to see the Federalists blur themselves out, and then we see the Republican Party, the Jeffersonian Party, split into Democrat Republicans and National Republicans. Of course, we know that Jackson and his Democrat Republicans adopt the name of Democrats, and the Whig Party themselves opens a doorway to become opposition candidates, both for the presidency of the United States and within the Senate themselves. And then we see the last tier of the political parties as they evolve up until the 1890s at least, with the Democrats and Republicans and some of their major supporters. Of course, these are only the politicians that existed prior to the and somewhat continuing during the Civil War. So, your book goes on to talk about the Compromise of 1850 and how that document in itself ends up shifting some of the political allegiances between the constituents of different parties, in this case the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, as we talked before, the northern and southern regions begin to blur as far as those who support the Compromise of 1850 and those who do not. Take, for instance, Daniel Webster, who actually ends up supporting the Compromise of 1850 as a Northern Whig and finds himself kicked out on the road, basically, by his political party for doing so. Your book goes on to talk about how many of the local issues that involved politics also were shaped during this period and defined by the Compromise of 1850, specifically in that state constitutions were redrawn. Some it was a crime for blacks to settle in different states. This actually gets reinforced after the Civil War by the passage of sundown laws. We'll talk a little bit more about that during Reconstruction and after. In Massachusetts, we see that economic issues become a little bit more focused. And we see through these state changes and party loyalties that politicians are beginning to recognize that national politics does not define the party system, not at least in the pre-war period. In the election of 1852, we see that the Whigs nominate General Winfield Scott, maybe thinking that they would win another general in the presidency, as they did with Zachary Taylor in 1848. They lose, although the Whigs do nominate Scott. The Democrats actually end up winning over a split ballot with the nomination of a man named Franklin Pierce, one of our least distinct presidents in the United States history. It took 52, or actually 49 ballots to even get his name on the ballot. This means that no one in the party convention of the Democrats had a majority of that party, of the votes during that period. Sorry. Um, two parties offered little choice, and they downplayed the issues. Well, it makes sense in this context in that political parties are not dealing with the major crisis issues of this period, which include the expansion of slavery, the regulation and or justification of states' rights, and in a much larger context, the constitutionality of different federal laws. In this case, the Compromise of 1850, which devolves actually in a sense to what we later see as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Before I go into this, I just did want to give you a brief example of political parties and their party platforms, because in your book asks about the realignment, okay, of the Republican Party, inferring that or implying that it begins in this column and ends up in this column, as if these two columns represent consistent political ideologies or positions. And that's not actually the case. There are many different economic and social issues that divide the parties as well. In the 2008 presidential election, the Republican Party put out their platform, which of course has a very nice graphic of all of the streetlights of the United States, and goes on to dedicate the platform to the heroes of America. And in this party platform, I wanted to point out that as the party of ideas rather than a mere coalition of interests, we consider vigorous debate a strength, not a weakness. Indeed, we are a party as we are a nation of mavericks. This, of course, is catering to the political campaign rhetoric of John McCain. And it's interesting that the Republicans contrast themselves with a coalition of interests, but not just a coalition of interests, a mere coalition of interests. The table of contents include how to defend our nation, how to reform government, how to expand opportunity, energy independence, protection of families, education, healthcare reform, and more. In the Democratic Party platform in 2008, there's a little bit of a different context. Notice the focus here is on renewing America's promise, in that case implying that something has been lost. They have a nice little logo, and then we get to the actual table of contents. In this case, renewing the American dream. I wanted to focus on renewing also American leadership, from foreign policy to other diplomatic initiatives. Renewing the American community. This seems to be something that the Republicans call the mere coalition of interests. And renewing American democracy. Okay. It's interesting also that these political parties and their platforms have to exist only through consensus and through party politics. And this is also true of this period as well, although the defining interests shift. And as those interests shift, one of the main issues that arises is the expansion of slavery, which Stephen Douglas believes he can solve through something that is known as the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, which celebrated in 2004 its 150th anniversary. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was often and is often credited by many historians as being one of the major stimulating factors of a political move towards civil war, in that it creates anarchy in the Kansas territory. All right, so let's get into that. Originally, Stephen Douglas wanted a railroad. It seemed as simple as that. He was a nationalist. He wanted the West developed. He was from Illinois, and he wanted a transcontinental to go through Chicago. So he thought that settlement of these two territories would facilitate that. Now, he had co-opted the idea by Lewis Cass in order to create the premise of allowing people the right to decide their political fate for themselves, which is the basic implication of popular sovereignty. Um, Douglas does something rather interesting, though, here, and that is he introduces this bill in 1854 to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories under the guise of popular sovereignty. Your book goes on to state that he thought that he could win the votes for the railroad without getting involved in the slavery dispute, because the common premise was that the climate and the soil conditions of Kansas and Nebraska would not support the the expansion of slavery, and that he miscalculated, as if he went to take a 3-point shot and missed. In this case, I think it's a little simple to claim that Douglas miscalculated. I think, of course, the issues were widely publicized, and as an intelligent man himself and a leader of the Democratic Party, specifically in the North, um, I think it would be rather simple to suggest that he didn't think that this would become a slavery issue. However, that's exactly what it became. So he was scandalized, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was scandalized as slavery despotism, hateful by Frederick Douglass, audacious villainy of slave power. It seemed also that many Northern Democrats, specifically Franklin Pierce in 1852 as president and Stephen Douglas in 1854 as one of the Senate leaders, were catering to the Southern interests, and that designation of slave power was an implication that the balance, the carefully sought after balance that was created in the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was beginning to fall apart. Your book, I think, eloquently does state right here that what began as a way of strengthening party lines over issues ended up destroying one party, planting deep, irreconcilable differences in another, and creating two new ones. So after a little, wander through some American expansionism, we'll return to that issue. So this section in your text actually puts into context the greater European imperialism that was going on in this time, in that sense that colonies were being created by European nations in order to facilitate and support the economic strength of industrialization. And this, in the year 1848, catalyzed in a backlash of college student revolts, and your book calls them Republican revolutions in many different countries in Europe. And this is true to a certain extent, although it can hardly be summarized in a single sentence. The complexity of some of the political dynamics that were going on during that period, especially with this is European history, but the ending of the Napoleonic crisis in the early 1800s and the reimposition at the Congress of Vienna of many of the European monarchs. That gets threatened in 1848 as a second wave of somewhat democratic revolutions begin to shake the European world. And it's in this period that many European countries, specifically Austria-Hungary, France, and Germany, begin to see the rise of a new political class. And that is something that Karl Marx, an economist and historian and philosopher, political philosopher, calls the proletariat. They are the working people that are politically astute and motivated. And in 1848, they had demanded recognition and success. And your book contrasts that with the expansionists and the nationalists in our country, who saw young America as this, institution to create new connections with other people. And I'm going to return to this section, and especially this map here in the next screencast. So I will see you then.